Previously, Bobby Fischerman successfully solved the Guardian's puzzle and was able to cross the bridge to nowhere. However, Peter Potzer and Average Joe did not solve it successfully and were forced to wait behind for Bobby to return. This is where we continue our story today. Bobby continued down the bridge towards Capablanca's house. It appeared to him that the house was empty, so he decided to go around to the backyard. And this is what he saw. There was a cat wearing sunglasses in a hammock. Bobby said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Capablanca. Could you tell me where to find him?" The cat said, "I'm Capablanca." Said, "What? You look surprised. Do you have something against cats?" Bobby said, "No, no, no. I love cats. I actually have a cat back home that I play chess against. Its name is Mittens. Anyway, the reason I'm here is I was hoping you could give me some information on how to get off of this island." Capablanca said, "Ah, yes, escaping the island. I can help you with that, but first, you need to solve this puzzle." And with that, he presented him with the following position. This is the position that Capablanca presented him with. Black's pawns are going down the board in this direction. Before I say too much, if you would like to pause, what do you think the winning move and idea is for white? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, first thing I want to say is this is an extremely complicated position. I am going to be leaving out some variations just so this doesn't turn into an overly complicated and super long video, but I'm going to be showing you what I consider to be the most important and most interesting variations. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand here is that black has the queen, which is a very dangerous piece, especially at the end of the game on a relatively open board. White has to be very careful that black isn't able to start getting some kind of crazy checks, either get a perpetual check or even capture some of white's pieces. However, white does have the nice thing going for them that black's king is almost in the corner, and all of these pieces are actually positioned pretty nicely to launch an attack on black's king. And that's how you need to start this puzzle, with the move knight to f3 check. Now, black has to make a decision where to move the king to. And the first thing that you need to understand is that on king to g2, we have a simple bishop takes c5 with the check, and there is a mate to follow on the next move. Okay, so that rules out king to g2 as an option for black. Also, in a similar fashion, king to h3 runs into knight to g5 check. And if you look carefully, this forces the king down to one of these two squares, which is in line with the rook, and now black will lose the queen to the discovered check. You have to move somewhere with your king, and then you lose the queen over here. So because of that, after knight to f3 check, the only move for black is to go into the corner, king to h1. And now is a very difficult moment in the puzzle. If you would like to pause, white only has one winning move. What is it? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the winning move for white is the move bishop to d4. And at first glance, it's like, what? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So here's the idea. The first point is that we're threatening checkmate on h2. This is a really nice knight and rook combo checkmate, and that's the main threat. Now, you might have been tempted to say, well, why don't we just take the pawn? We still threaten the checkmate, but we also attack black's queen. So we kind of have a double threat. Isn't that going to be better? And the answer is no, and here is why. Black will play the move queen to a4 check, which is a fork. Now you can defend the rook with the knight and actually block the check at the same time, but black has this amazing move, queen takes d4 check. You have to take it, and now we have a stalemate. Black can't move the king. The pawn is also blockaded, and so it's a weird stalemate, but a draw nonetheless. So that's kind of the first point of why bishop takes c5 doesn't work. Now, why do we go to d4? Well, one point of that is, I believe, if I'm understanding this position correctly, is that we are stopping queen to a4 checks. And also, in some lines, on queen to c7, you could block with the bishop, and then also you're controlling some squares over here, which, like I said, there's a lot of variations in this one because the queen has so many options. I'm not going to get bogged down in covering every single move that black could play, but just kind of focus on the main ones. So bishop to d4 is the move. Now black has, like I said, a lot of options, but two of the most obvious ones would be the two checks. So queen to f7 and queen to c7 check. So let's go ahead and start with queen to c7 check. Instead of blocking with the bishop, it's actually better to block with the knight. And the first point is that the pawn can't actually take you because of the pin, and it's actually difficult for black to come up with the move because the king can't move. The pawn, like I said, doesn't want to capture. You could push, but that doesn't really accomplish much. The queen doesn't have a lot of options. You don't have a check because the knight. And so queen to b8 makes sense, keeping the pin, but also setting up a check over here. But then you have this line, rook to b2, attacks the queen. Queen slides over for the check. King to g3, and notice black's king now is about to get checkmated here with the rook. And so check, the knight blocks, and even though you lose the bishop, you still get checkmated like this. Okay, so that's, again, just one example of how the game could go. So let's go back. And that was if the queen decided to play queen to c7 check. Now, a better try for black is queen to f7 check. And here, if you would like to pause, what should white play here? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the only move for white is actually king to e3. You have to get away from the queen, but you have to do it in the right way. If you were actually to go to g3 to try to escape, you fall into this fork here, and you're going to lose your rook, and you'll lose the game. Now, king to e3, you might say, wait a second, Nelson, aren't we giving up our bishop with check? The answer is yes, we are. Why would we do that? Well, it's because we have this really nice follow-up move, king to f2. And essentially what we have done is transferred our king behind the knight so that it's shielded from the queen. Additionally, we have totally trapped black's king in the corner so that we now have some checkmate threats with our rook that black has to deal with. So this was a very good idea, and it's worth sacrificing the bishop. One of the things about knights and queens that's interesting in chess, and this is not just in the endgame, at any point in a game of chess, if your king is being attacked by a queen, if you can defend with a knight, that's going to be one of the best defensive pieces that you can use because of the way that the knight covers a lot of these squares where the queen might eventually like to put you in check. And we're going to see that in just a second. So queen to f4 is black's best try to bring the queen closer and potentially come into e3. And you can see what I'm talking about here. The knight is very nicely controlling all of these squares so that the queen, doesn't have these checks available, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so queen to f4. And again, this is another extremely difficult moment in the puzzle. If you would like to pause, what is white's only winning move in this position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move for white here is the move rook to c6. Now, at first glance, this looks like just a random square. Like, why would we pick c6 over any other square? Well, let's back up a second. Black does have the threat of queen to e3, so you might have been tempted to say rook to e2 to stop that. But here's what black will play. Queen to e3 check, sacrificing the queen because they get your rook. And even though we have the knight and we're going to win this pawn, you can't checkmate with the king and a knight against the king. It's just going to be a draw, right? So that's kind of black's idea. That's why we can't play rook to e2. Now, rook to c6 is a very weird move, but what I want you to look at carefully is this. Look at this queen and look at this diagonal right here. And this is super important because if you imagine, for example, that the queen were to just step away from that diagonal, we simply have checkmate. We can either go to h6 or we can go to c1, and the game is just over. Remember, the king is stuck. That's just an easy checkmate, right? So black's queen has to guard these threats, okay? But if you look carefully, where can the queen move to that's on the diagonal? Well, you can't move here because of the rook. You can't move here because of the knight. You can't move here or here because of the rook and the knight. You only have queen to e3 check available, or you have to move something else, which would be the pawn. Okay, and so because of that, we can see that black only has two options in this position, d3 and queen to e3 check. The king can't move, and none of the other queen moves make any sense because you're going to leave one of these checkmate threats open to white if you move the queen off that diagonal. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and start with the move queen to e3 check. Now, if they play the check, we're going to go king to g3. And again, you can see the power of the knight defending the king. Look at all of the potential checks that the queen might have. The knight is covering them all, right? So black doesn't really have any good checks. And so now, again, black has kind of the same problem of we've got a threat here, we've got a threat here, and the queen has to guard it. But again, look at this diagonal carefully. Everything is covered. The knight and the rook and the king are covering every single square on that diagonal. So what does that mean? There's only one move for black. You have to push the pawn. That's literally all you can do. The king can't move, the queen can't move. You have to push the pawn. And now if you would like to pause, what do we play here as white to win the game? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is rook to a6. And what we are doing now is trying to create multiple different checkmate threats that the queen can't stop. Okay, so now we have these two threats that the queen has to control, which black can do with the move queen to c1. Black's defending that, also defending that. And now we have another move, if you would like to pause. What is it? If you had a chance to look at that, it's the move rook to a7. And again, we're creating two more different checkmate threats, but this time the black queen doesn't have a way to control both of those threats. And so it doesn't really matter what black does. They're going to get checkmated one way or the other on one of these two squares. They can come over here to h6 to stop this one, but then they allow this checkmating idea, or if they keep the queen somewhere down here and I don't know, push a random pawn, they allow this one. And either way you look at it, black gets checkmated, okay? So that's kind of the point behind what we were trying to do with rook to c6. Now, going back here, some of you might be wondering, why did we have to go to c6? Like, couldn't we go to c8? And it looks almost like this would be a better try, but it turns out that black has queen to e3 check, and then they go to h6, and we don't have the same follow-ups that we had earlier when the rook was on c6. You could try rook to b8 to try to come down like this, but then you fall into this fork, and it just doesn't work out the same way. Without getting overly complicated, I'll just leave it at that, all right? So going back here, rook to c6, we saw what happens if the queen goes to e3 check. The only other move that white had was pawn to d3. And again, it's the same kind of idea of, okay, where's the queen going to go when we have all of these squares covered? And actually, after d3 is played, what you'll notice is that queen to e3 is no longer a move. And this is kind of an important part about this. So with that in mind, what do you think the best move for white is in this position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, it's the move rook to c8 now. And I know it's super weird because before it was you went rook to b6, now we're going rook to c8. And the idea is the same. You're trying to put black in Zugzwang where the queen has nowhere to move and it can't stop both of the checkmate threats. The way that you do it is different depending on what black does, right? So for example, if you try rook to b6 here, it doesn't work out the same because after queen to c1, and I think last time we played, was it rook to b7? Here, black has this move queen to c2, followed by d2, and notice how like the queen is somehow defending. It's really weird, and honestly, I didn't even wrap my mind totally around this when I was looking at it. But essentially, there's different options that black has depending on which position you're in, and in this one, you have to go to c8 because this is the way that black cannot stop the checkmate. So after rook to h6, if you'd like to pause, what's the follow-up here? If you had a chance to look at that, it's rook to b8. Same idea as before. We're creating these two threats, and finally black is out of moves. They can't defend both of them. So I know that was really weird. In one case, you go to c6 and you go over to b6. In the next case, you go to c6 and you go down to c8. Same idea, but because of the options that black's queen has that are just slightly different, depending on where this pawn was, it changes where the rook needed to go. Hopefully that made sense. I know this was a much more difficult puzzle than some of the other ones that we've covered, but still really nice Zugzwang on the queen, and black has no options and no way to defend both of the checkmates. So congratulations if you found that, and if not, hopefully you at least learned something about the knight being a good defender against the queen. Now, at this point, having successfully solved the puzzle, Capablanca said, "Nicely done. Now I will answer your question." So to my knowledge, the only way to get off the island is to hire a pirate from the pirate's harbor and have them take you where you would like to go. But here's the catch. Pirates only accept gold as payment, and the only gold on the island is located in the dragon's lair. How you're going to get it from the dragon's lair, well, you'll have to figure that out on your own, but that's the only way that I know of to escape the island. Bobby said, "Thank you very much for that information. I will go and return and tell that to my friends. And he proceeded to leave and go back down the bridge to return to the island. However, when he got back to where he had left his friends, Peter Potter and Average Joe, they were nowhere to be seen. Bobby looked around. He didn't see them anywhere, and he didn't know what to do next. And that's where we'll pick up the story next time. As always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.